I think the focus should be on building that cohort of people that share your values, are ready to act with you in order to hold that new government to account and sort of drive forward your main concerns.
Welcome to a brand new episode of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leading differently. I'm Paul Thomas.
And I'm Zoe Amma. Our podcast exists to help leaders and their teams understand what they need to do differently today to prepare for the world of tomorrow. We started Starts at the Top as a podcast about digital disruption, but we soon realised that leaders were telling us about something more important and urgent, about how traditional ways of leading had changed forever.
And we make it our mission to speak to leaders who are carving out new ways of leading, and we cover topics from emerging tech to inclusion, from remote work to mental health and climate change. Basically, all of the subjects that today's leaders need to be across in 2024.
Our podcast isn't about shiny corporate case studies. It's about lessons learned and progress made the hard way, and crucially, how that can inspire others. In this episode, we share our conversation with Berry Cochrane, CEO of digital mobilisation agency Forward Action.
And it can't have escaped your attention that the general election has been called in the UK and it will take place on the 4th of July. So this episode is the first of two with a focus on managing the political landscape as a leader. Our chat with Berry digs into the work that Forward Action does, garnering the potential of digital to drive change by building people power at scale. It's a fascinating look at how leaders should be thinking about the topic of mobilisation and standing out from the crowd at election time.
So talking of the election, Paul, you've just shared a couple of really interesting articles, especially this one from the BBC, about the level of misinformation being shared amongst young voters, particularly on TikTok.
Yeah, hot off the press, because I was wondering about something that we could talk about today, and this popped up. So I've just been reading and listening to as much as I possibly can, but it's fascinating. Two parts, really. The article shares some worrying news about the level of misleading election news being shared on TikTok between users, including things like, the stuff that you always see, AI-generated videos featuring party leaders, misinformation and clips loaded with abusive comments. And it also talks about the start of the sort of the meme war, I guess, between the political parties, again, on TikTok, hoping to reach younger voters. But the really fascinating part is that these videos that they found were spotted as part of the BBC's Undercover Voters project. And we'll share the link in the description. But this is something that the BBC did around the US elections, where they created a few profiles for different people across the US states and sort of managed social media profiles for all of them. But what they've done here is they've created 24 fictional people on all the major social media sites based on data and analysis by the National Centre for Social Research, which is NatCen. And these fictional profiles represent a range of voters in battleground constituencies across the UK and hopefully give an insight into what content is being promoted to different types of people. Profiles are private, they have no friends, they just like, follow and watch content that's relevant to the character traits that have been informed by this NatCen research. And it was funny because when I was listening to the podcast, the presenter likened it to having 24 Tamagotchis in her bag. It's that sort of, I've got to look after these people and I've got to feed them. And what I think is fascinating is this is really interesting insight into the algorithms deployed by social media sites. So we all have a unique feed of information that only we see. And Zoe, we've just talked about, we have shared interests. We might have similar political leanings, but we have really different views of the world fed to us through our social channels. So this project can really help to open our eyes as to how vast this difference actually is across the UK for different types of voters. So I'd urge people to go and listen to it.
Wow, that sounds fascinating. Be really interesting to see the content that's getting served to those 24 different personas. It really makes you think about the complexity and the fragmentation of the digital landscape.
It's absolutely nuts. That's what the long and short of it, I think, is nuts that they are prepared to do this. And as I said, these profiles are being created on 24 different mobile phones. So they're not sort of aggregated by any platform. These are, to all intents and purposes, 24 different people. So I'd really urge people to go and have a listen to it and follow along. They're going to do regular updates on what these profiles are seeing and what the differences are. So keep an eye on the articles. We'll share the links in the show notes. And then the other thing that's very, very similar to this, or very much in the same vein, and I think is even more worrying, is that misinformation, the battle against misinformation, is also being reported widely elsewhere. We'll share a link to an article that quotes the ITN chief executive, Rachel Korp, whose company produces 5 News, ITV News, Channel 4 News, and she spoke at the Media and Telecoms 2024 and Beyond conference in London this week. And she's warning that we're going to be absolutely flooded with artificial intelligence created propaganda, and that she's been lobbying, or ITN have been lobbying the government about this for well over a year. And she says that the challenge is that traditional broadcasters like ITN, like BBC, Channel 5, those sort of traditional news programmes, aren't going to be able to keep viewers up to date and warn them against deep fakes and misinformation, largely because of the volume and speed of the spread of online news versus that traditional TV news, even on rolling channels. So, for example, if you're stood outside of a polling station saying, "Oh, Mr. Blogs, who have you voted for? And isn't this your dog? Isn't that very nice?" But everyone at home is being bombarded on their phones by fake news and misinformation on their social media channels. How do you compete against that? So really sort of worrying news for journalists and journalism in the face of the UK elections this year.
It's scary, isn't it? Because it makes you think that this election in particular, everyone's going to have this highly personalised, highly nuanced newsfeed in their hands, rather than, as we probably both saw in those first elections we voted in, that you have more of a single source of truth through, traditional media. And I think this election is going to be really game changing in that way, in a very scary way, in that I just don't know how you manage this flood of misinformation that we will see. And for me, it threatens the very integrity of journalism, because the reason why I think people become journalists is because they want to be the person who breaks the best stories and the person who writes for the media outlets, who's got that view of what's really happening. And then how you compete with this incredibly sophisticated but untruthful content is really worrying, isn't it? Because I remember that 1997 election, which was the first one I voted in, and which I'm quite nostalgic about now for several reasons. But I remember that you didn't have to work super hard to try and find out what was going on. The policies, the facts of what were happening in the news, you could get that. But now it feels like rolling news isn't just about who's got the best stories and the best access to what's really happening. It's about who's got the best content. And that's where the quality of the content, the truthfulness of the news itself, and therefore the fabric of democracy, is getting torn apart. And I think that's an incredibly worrying issue for our times. And how you even begin to unpick that with young people who may be voting in their first election, or at that stage of rapidly forming their views because they may be voting in the one afterwards, it's really frightening, really frightening.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I don't see any way out of it. As she says, there's no way for them to be able to flag where fake information is coming from. You've just got to hope that sense prevails and people can figure out what's real and what's not. But it's just getting harder and harder and harder to do that.
And I wonder whether we'll see AI being produced on more of that localized level, because I think that some of the famous deepfakes we've seen in politics so far has been more about very high profile people like Keir Starmer and Sadiq Khan, who've obviously been subject to this deepfake technology. But you can see how if you're in a very tight seat in the UK, where AI could potentially be more influential than in, say, a safe seat somewhere, that there could be a really strong incentive for some bad actors to produce this kind of content. Because actually you can produce this kind of content relatively easily now, and the quality is getting better all the time.
Yeah, I think the example in the article is that, somebody could create a video of Rishi Sunak high-fiving Vladimir Putin quite easily. And what does that suddenly going out across TikTok, across Instagram, what does that do? People probably understand that it's not real, but some people won't. So I think you're absolutely right. In those situations where it is quite tight, anything could sway somebody's decision on what to do. And you know as well as I do that a lot of this stuff is coming from countries outside of the UK as well, who have slightly darker intentions, as well as just people having a bit of fun on TikTok. Worrying times, but stay tuned. Starts at the top, and we'll help you to navigate through these difficult times.
Absolutely. And we hope that the content we are sharing with you as part of these 2 episodes, which are election specials, will be helpful for people, and particularly leaders, to find a path through what I think is going to be quite a challenging month ahead. And now for a conversation with Berry Cochrane.
Berry Cochrane is CEO of digital mobilisation agency Forward Action. They help progressive organisations to maximise the potential of digital to drive change by building people power at scale. Since joining last year, Berry has built on the strong foundations by focusing attention on helping partners to develop creative campaigns, build volunteer power through digital organising, and exploring the impact of AI on campaigning. Before joining Forward Action, she was head of digital mobilisation at Greenpeace and led the digital team at Amnesty International UK. Berry, welcome to Starts at the Top.
Thanks. Hi. It's good to be here.
Good to have you. Now, we started with that little bio, and in digital mobilisation was the key term. So for some of our listeners who aren't so sure, could you tell us a bit more about what it means?
Yeah, so it's essentially about using digital to engage people in the causes that they care about, and encouraging them to use a share of their time, money and voice, essentially. So kind of thinking about anything that is useful to help an organisation or a cause achieve the change they want to see, that a person can give, and making sure that you're kind of connecting that need and the cause with the person who has the interest in taking action, if that makes sense. So an example, like a big part of the mobilisation model is driving kind of list building. So the first thing is trying to reach people at scale with your values. So like with values led engagement asks, so that the people coming onto your list really share your values, so that when they then get onto your list, you're able to follow up with meaningful asks that they can give, that they can do over the course of your campaign to help deliver that change. And you know that they are much more likely to do that with you and go on that journey with you because they've joined you based on the values that you both share. So that's it, essentially. So it's signing petitions, signing hand raisers, emailing your MP, tweeting at targets, donating to support campaigns. All of these things fit into digital mobilisation, and it's essentially just the most effective way of helping people to do that with the causes that they care about.
That's great. And when I mentioned you were coming onto the podcast to someone I know, they said, "Oh, find out a bit more about hand raisers." That's the fascinating bit for everyone. The hand raisers. So you just explain that, because there might be some people like my mum listens who might see a hand raiser but might not actually know what it is.
So a hand raiser is like just one of the tools of digital mobilisation that is essentially about thinking through what your organisational or cause values are and enabling someone to, I suppose, say that they agree with them. So using your values as a magnet is kind of like the technique that you would use. So rather than it necessarily being a petition that you sign to a target, so for example, here is the problem, our solution to it is that Rishi Sunak needs to develop this new policy, sign a petition to influence Rishi Sunak. Rather than it being that, it's more something like, so for example, we work with the organisation Dignity in Dying, and we helped them to build out a hand raiser that was a record of support for legalised assisted dying. And so it's essentially, it allows people to just add their name to that record of support as a first engagement with that cause. So it's thinking about, okay, what is it that as an organisation we really believe in, that we want to allow people to express their belief in too, and providing them with the mechanism to do that. And so you can add your name to that record of support. In doing that, if you opt in, you then go onto an email list where Dignity in Dying is able to follow up with you as somebody who has said you support that aim, to ask you to follow up with sort of actions that help to drive change by influencing the targets that they have for that policy change. So it's really kind of a first point of engagement with a cause or campaign that is driven by those shared values, and allows you, I mean, it's called a hand raiser, and it's essentially allows you to kind of like raise your hand and say, I believe in this. This is something that I really believe in, and I want to kind of tell everybody that I believe in it. So I'm adding my name to that. So it's different to a petition in the sense that it's not addressed at a target.
Absolutely. And I think what that speaks to really was that incredibly busy digital landscape that charities are in now, and how they have to work really hard to stand out. And obviously that's going to be even more of a challenge this year, isn't it? Because once we know when the election is, and obviously with all these elections happening globally as well, we know that charities are going to have to work even harder to stand out online. What can charities do to really differentiate themselves in this busy digital space during an election year?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of that is the same as in any year, to be honest. Like, a lot of the best practice remains the same. And I think for me, one of the really important fundamental things is, well, first of all, being able to distill your values in the way that we've just talked about, so that people really understand if they are taking action with you, and if they are, you know, even liking your post on social or whatever, they really understand what it is that you are saying and where you come from. And as part of that, just if you are a charity that's trying to kind of campaign for change, having a really clear theory of change and understanding what your strategy is for delivering it, and then what people's role is in helping you do that, and really being able to articulate that clearly so that audiences understand it and are motivated by what they can help you achieve, and really see their specific role. So if you're asking anybody to do anything online, just always really being very clear about the impact that is going to have, and why they specifically, like how they will help to deliver that impact. We call that a supporter theory of change. And I think having a really clear supporter theory of change is really key to standing out in a crowded space online, because it helps to drive that kind of meaningful connection with an organisation. And if you're values driven at the same time, then you're really kind of building that relationship, and people just really see you as their partner for that change. I think the other thing, again, this is not specific to an election year, but perhaps we need to be even more aware of it in an election year, is really understanding who we need to reach with our message or our campaign, and like where they are, and the types of content that they're engaging with, and the types of conversations that they're having. So again, you can be a much more authentic presence in their life, so that you're really kind of building that relationship with them and establishing yourselves as the person that they should be listening to, or like stopping the scroll for, because they want to hear what you have to say on a particular issue that is relevant to their lives in that moment. And like a kind of follow up from that is being set up to be able to be really responsive. So where a conversation begins that relates to your cause or your issue, or even where it doesn't, but you feel that you can have an authoritative voice on it, just being set up so that you're kind of very quick out the door with that take on it. So that you're really part of that conversation for people, and they really see you as that source of information. And like I say, as kind of a partner for their kind of experience this year, I suppose. And being able to be responsive, like not just on social media, but also using email to be really responsive, and like driving forward action in that space, so that people really see value from being on your email list, helping them to keep engaged there. And I think really understanding the channels that you're on, so that you really understand the user behavior there. So not trying to kind of do a one size fits all approach across, for example, various different social media platforms, but understanding the really specific user behaviors in those platforms and the demographics that are on them, and like be like reviewing those platforms daily, and really being ready to like read the trends and adapt to those trends, and adopt quite an experimental approach to content. So not being afraid to fail, because in that space, there's always going to be things that don't really go very far. But for every like viral post, you might have 9 that are really mediocre. But if you take that experimental approach and you're really leaning in and trying out different trends and seeing which ones work best for your tone of voice, for your message, and what connects with your audience, you're going to be much closer to getting those ones that really push beyond your kind of like most engaged followers and help you kind of reach that bigger audience with your messages. And another thing which maybe is slightly more specific or is definitely becoming more used in an election year, it's definitely a big part of like the Biden administration strategy is thinking about how you use influencers and how influencers can be a really important part of your sort of strategy for reaching people. There's a campaign in the UK called Give an X that is all about trying to register as many younger voters as they can before the election, because it's a kind of historically underrepresented voter population. And they've been doing some really amazing work with influencers, and I think they delivered, it was 183,000 new young people registering to vote in the last day before the deadline for the 2nd of May elections. And that was just using a really smart influencer strategy. And that, I think, comes back to that thing of really understanding who your audience is, who it is that is going to kind of speak to them, and having exactly the right ask and a really clear theory of change behind it. I'm talking a lot here. I've got one more thing. I think it's really important to be creative in your campaign. I talked earlier about how like hand raisers aren't kind of another ask to Rishi Sunak, I suppose, which is one of the things that I think makes them quite effective in a context where people are feeling quite a lot of kind of political apathy as that first contact piece. And I think the other thing that we need to be doing is thinking really laterally about, if we are having things like petitions or emails to target or whatever it is, that we're thinking about who those targets are to make sure that that theory of change is really persuasive, because we've seen over the last year that, for example, the Conservative government isn't particularly responsive to public pressure. So if we're continually asking people to target that government with asks, that's not very compelling and not very persuasive. So in a really crowded landscape where that's what everybody's asking to do, if you think more laterally about your targets, so for example, Freedom from Torture, in their campaign around the Rwanda legislation, instead of targeting the government, they decided to target Privilege Airlines, which was one of the airlines that was going to be tasked with flying refugees and asylum seekers to Rwanda. And by doing that, number one, they had a really compelling theory of change, which was, we can stop these flights from going ahead. We don't even need it to come from the government. And the second was, they knew that Privilege, as a small airline, very unused to having any kind of public pressure, was much more likely to bow to it. And so they did really amazing creative campaigning in order to influence that target. And they did eventually say that they would pull out and they wouldn't take any flights to Rwanda. So it was a really great way for them to kind of stand out in a very crowded space by thinking really creatively about who the target was. And then once you have that target, you can also think creatively about the way in which you're influencing them. And it kind of helps to spread your message, because people are much more convinced by it as a mechanism for change. And I think the final thing I'd say that is specific to an election year is really making sure that your asks sort of match the moment. And I think I've said this already, but like, we are aware that right now there is quite a lot of apathy out there. So it's really how you can make sure people understand that by kind of acting with you or engaging with you or supporting your cause, they'll really help achieve the change that they want to see. And I think petitions and hand raisers and things like that really do still have a role to play in terms of building your list and kind of growing your movement. But I think it's really important to recognise that in a year like this, we can be asking more of people, and not to shy away from what we might consider kind of higher bar asks. And historically, we would have definitely thought they need to be kind of like second, third, fourth asks that we give to people once they engage with us. It's doing a little bit of sort of testing how, for example, a volunteer ask might go if you give that as the first ask to somebody, because in this kind of year, those people that want to act and want to change things are really ready to do that, and they're ready to do a bit more, even though there is also a lot of apathy out there. I think those are my main things.
That's amazing, Very. Wow, that's like a whole toolkit in and of itself, and that's so helpful, because what I love about that is clearly there's some things that are very specific to an election year, but there's also that best practice which we should all be thinking about anyway, shouldn't we? As in, who are we trying to reach, how are we trying to reach them, what do we want them to do? And if the election year is the kind of rocket we all need to get on and do that, that's a good thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I think definitely, exactly. I think all of the best practice rules are just the same. It doesn't really change. It's just, one would hope it kind of gives us much more motivation to follow them. And the other thing that I don't think I mentioned is obviously just testing everything all the time, so that you're really kind of making sure that you are learning as you put things out there, and you're seeing how they're going, and you're really learning for your particular cause what the best messaging is, what the best way to engage people is, what's really resonating with people, so that you can kind of like feed back that learning and kind of constantly allow it to fuel your kind of future outputs.
That makes a lot of sense. And if I could just compare notes on something with you at the moment, it's interesting because the election is coming up quite a lot in conversations with the charities we're working with, but then I'm not quite clear on, how worried people are about it specifically, and whether they are on that war footing yet with their digital channels. What's your take on what's going out there, whether it's in the sector or beyond the sector? Are people getting ready to mobilise and focus on doing more campaigning, or are people just waiting and seeing what happens depending on when the election is going to be? What are you seeing through the work that you're doing?
We're seeing a bit of both, to be honest. So there are definitely some organisations that we're working with already on gearing up to deliver their election strategy. And so I suppose what they're focusing on in this period is really doing that thing of trying to build that cohort of people who will be ready to act with them once an election is called and it's clearer kind of what the demands are going to be. And then there are organisations like Greenpeace who have been working all year on this Project Climate Vote initiative, which is really, I think, a brilliant campaign that is about essentially trying to show that climate is a voting issue and that the parties need to take it seriously. And so they've been recruiting and mobilising volunteers to kind of go out and do door knocking in their local areas to get people to pledge to be a climate voter. And so that they're putting kind of, posters in their windows saying that, and they're also signing an online pledge, basically with the aim of building up a million people who have pledged to be a climate voter, to really be able to take that to political parties and say, you need to care about climate this election because it's going to impact on how people are voting. So I guess their focus is like building up that body of evidence to be able to then influence potentially manifestos. So needing to do it sooner than when an election is called in order to have that time to influence the manifestos. Obviously, we have the Lobbying Act, which restricts what a lot of organisations are kind of comfortable with doing. And I think we are seeing the impact of that. And so some organisations that we work with will just not do much around the election at all, while others are kind of limited in what they'll do as a result of that. But they are still trying to, influence party policies and also provide a bit of a resource to people to kind of help make informed decisions about who they vote for, not influencing that vote, but just relating kind of, these are the things that are the important issues, and this is how all of the parties are talking about them. Go away and make your own decisions, sort of that kind of thing. And I think the other thing that's quite on a lot of organisations that we talk to's mind is the post-election period, almost more so than the pre-election period, in terms of the opportunity to influence whatever government it is that we get, and really kind of making the most of that first 100 days and how we do that effectively, and like what good campaigning and influencing looks like in that first 100 days, and how, again, with the apathy, and we know historically like that sort of post-election period has often been a time when it has been quite hard to mobilise people. Kind of how can we try and counter that trend this time in order to sort of drive progressive change through in that first 100 days, regardless of who is voted in, is another thing that we're kind of having quite a few conversations about.
So in other words, you need to start getting ready now for something where we don't know what it is, when it is. Yeah, but we all need to start getting ready now.
Yeah, we do. We all do need to start getting ready now. I mean, if your organisation wants to affect change through UK politics, then definitely you need to be thinking about what that looks like. And even if what that is for you this year, like if you feel restricted by the Lobbying Act to the extent that you don't want to do any kind of like explicit campaigning around the general election, I think the focus should be on building that cohort of people that share your values, are ready to act with you. There are lots of other things they can be doing. There's lots of other ways to kind of create change in this year. But just making sure you're kind of bringing them in, building that big body of people up so that when we are in that first 100 days period, you've got as big a possible collection of people who are ready to act with you in order to hold that new government to account and sort of drive forward your main concerns.
It makes a lot of sense. And then the other thing that I'm hearing from charities, as they think ahead to the election and what's going on digitally, is also lots of concern about the rise of misinformation, disinformation, and we know there's going to be even more of that online this year. How do you think charities should prepare for that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because I think it is a rise, definitely. I feel like it's not necessarily new, just because of the way that media has worked over a long period of time, on a number of different issues, and sort of the voices that are allowed to rise to the top. But so I think it's, again, I kind of think a lot of what charities and organizations need to be doing is not necessarily new things. I think the most important thing is really thinking about establishing yourself as a trusted source of information. So that comes back to this thing of like building those meaningful relationships with people and really kind of having that authenticity in the spaces that you're speaking. So making sure that you are sharing that relevant information in accessible ways and ways that are appropriate to the platform on which you're speaking. So obviously, I think that's about definitely digital and kind of being on social media and making sure that you're sharing a lot of different kinds of relevant information on social media in platform appropriate ways that really resonate with the audiences that are on there. It's also about providing that source on your website so that people can kind of access it if they're interested in that, making sure your SEO is up to scratch and that you're using kind of AdWords and things really effectively so that if people are searching for information on things that relate to your cause, you are there as the top result to make sure that you're kind of giving that, trusted information and establishing yourself really as the voice on an issue. And I think it's obviously also about building your media profile as part of that, because this misinformation, disinformation war kind of is also happening in kind of more traditional media spaces as well. So just really trying to kind of have your voice in all of those spaces, not necessarily as like a direct attack or in direct conversation with the disinformation that we're seeing, but more about really focusing on you just becoming that trusted source of information for people. And I think like obviously misinformation is kind of like slightly less innocuous than disinformation. So kind of making sure that you're not like attacking people who are just getting things a bit wrong and being kind of quite a kind of supportive person to help people learn and to kind of educate and to really show people what the truth is, but then really being very clear when something is disinformation, where it does actually have a kind of more intentional disruptive, it's like an intentional disruptive act. And in that sense, it is more about kind of really challenging that. Though I think the best way to challenge that is not necessarily head on, where you can end up kind of fueling it and giving it more audience than you want to, but is instead about really focusing on what your message is and making sure that's getting out to as many people as possible. And I think there are like certain ways, like obviously not all organizations have money to spend on ads, but I do think there is a lot that you can do within the ad space around kind of getting that information in front of the right people and really kind of making sure that again it's just established as the kind of reliable piece of source of information. And there's like a tool called Who Targets Me, which can help you see like where a lot of ad spend is going, and on there you can use that to decide like where to target your ad spend so that you're making sure that you're reaching, I don't know. So for example, an environmental organization might want to look on there to see like who is Shell targeting with their greenwashing ads. And then they can then say, okay, well, we need to target these same people with our alternative narrative, not as again in like head-on conflict with it, but just so that the same people are getting to see that alternative voice. And making sure that you're kind of reaching those like right groups with the truth. I think that's it. And it just really is about making sure that you're, as this kind of trusted source of information, you're really focusing on making that content as clear, convincing and compelling as possible. And that you're finding lots of different ways to tell that story so that different people can access it in different ways and learn in different ways, because we all have different learning styles, and just, really making that a key part of sort of what you're factoring into how you're communicating.
So that's fascinating, because you almost have to think like a media outlet then.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think like not all organizations are going to be focused on tackling misinformation, disinformation, and different organizations will obviously be less impacted by it than others. So there are like particular organizations that are working on issues that are really like very much a live part of the culture wars. And I think those tend to be the issues where we're really seeing that disinformation creep in. And So they will need to be focusing on this in a way that like other organizations probably don't need to so much. But if you are needing to focus on it, I think it is thinking like a media organization. And the way in which you're different to a media organization is that you can build those kind of personal relationships of trust in a way by also kind of trying to give people ways in which they can then, if you're sharing your truth, then allowing them ways to kind of engage with you if they agree with, if, again, it comes back to the value sharing piece. And then you can kind of bring them into your email list, and then they can kind of be part of your community in a way that probably is slightly different to a media organization. But I think it's all about compelling storytelling and how you share your truth really effectively. I keep saying truth as though that's in some way a like contested thing. Obviously, disinformation is obviously not truth, and for most NGOs and charities, they are talking about the truth. But I just feel in this space, you have to kind of like caveat it slightly.
And you talked about the places and the channels. And I know this could be different for every organisation, but where are you seeing the most sort of creativity in bringing people to action? Where is the appetite for action and change coming from? And please don't tell me it's X.
I don't think it is. Well, it depends. Like, X has never been. Well, no, okay, no, but I don't think it is. I think there's an increasing amount of sort of social justice conversation and content on TikTok. So very much in terms of sort of information and the information wars and this kind of question, like TikTok is definitely a space that people need to be in order to kind of be sharing that information and being part of that conversation. What TikTok is less good at is driving action. Well, from the platform, obviously in terms of sort of attribution modeling, we need to get better at it to understand if it does impact people's action taking further down the line from different places. But from platform, it's sort of historically not very good at delivering that because people tend to stay in platform and you can't really do actions in platform. But it's definitely a key space of conversation and a really important place for people to have a presence. We still find that the most effective platform for kind of driving actual action taking in terms of people signing things or signing up to things is Meta. And it's obviously like different demographics, but across Instagram and Facebook, that's where we see that's just in terms of sort of platform behavior, that is just much more a part of the user behavior in those spaces. And then the other thing that continues to be in our work, an ongoing kind of driver of action is email lists. So getting people on your email list and then driving action from there is still like one of the most effective ways that you can drive action at scale. And then, of course, sort of developing from there, but as a similar way of communicating with people is WhatsApp. So there's also increasing like private sharing. And at Greenpeace, we, off the back of sort of petitions, signs, have what you call a daisy chain. And as part of that, you're asking people to share. And when we added the WhatsApp button, Facebook had always been the highest performing share ask. And as soon as we added WhatsApp, it like overtook it. It was like 5 times the amount. I can't quite remember the exact numbers. But so WhatsApp is a really important space for that sort of information sharing and also kind of driving action through your users sharing things. So it should be a big part of these conversations, I think.
I do a lot of work in the private sector, in the corporate world, and usually this sort of thing is driving an action to put your name on an email list, and that email list is used to send you marketing material, invite you to events. And I think there's probably lessons for organisations in the private sector to learn from this activism. It's, as you said, you're spending a great deal of effort to get people to follow you and to sign up to and align with your organisation, but I don't think half as much effort goes in the private sector in order to really make that connection between subscriber, follower, and cause and/or reason for being. I think it doesn't exist quite so in the same way. So I'm just going to take that away and have a think about it for a little while and how we can
use it for the corporate enemy
to learn lessons. Yeah. Or at least, and I think it is coming up with some of my clients where, I work with professional services organisations, accountancy firms, they have clients who are going to be going like they are through an election year. And what does that mean? What is the impact of that going to be on their organisation? And it's kind of a similar thing. It's just not as cause-led. So it's just interesting to listen to you talking about this and think, oh, okay, there must be a sort of a reinterpretation of this for other sectors where it's not quite.
Who knows what will happen when the accountants are mobilised?
Well, Zoe, as
Maybe
you and
our
I
secret
both
weapon.
know, accountants will save the world. There was a famous, I think it was a Forbes article a good few years ago now called "Accountants Will Save the World," and it did argue it quite well. So we can share that in the show notes so people can see it. I'm not so sure, but some of them.
Every revolution needs a spreadsheet. I mean, come on, it does, surely. How else are you going to budget?
Yeah. So no, but Barry didn't mention Google Docs and spreadsheets as one of those places where people are hanging out to drive positive change.
Well, we're interested to see what
Everything has its role.
It's just even the accountants mobilising. So we'll look forward to seeing them storming across Westminster Bridge. Who knows what could happen during an election year? Barry, this has been fascinating. I've just got one more question to ask. I've learned so much from this conversation. I really hope of charities and social sector organisations take on board your excellent advice. When we spoke a few weeks ago, you talked about calls to action and giving people meaningful things to do. And speaking to you again today, one thing that's really come through and which I'm seeing a lot out there also is that thing of the apathy and the fatigue and everyone being quite kind of ground down and, what difference can I make individually? Tell us a bit more about those calls to action, the things you can ask people to do so that they get energised and inspired during a difficult year.
Yeah, it goes back to sort of what I was talking about in terms of essentially effective campaigning and understanding what your theory of change is and the role that people play in it. Like if we're talking in the context of mobilisation. And I think to have impact and in order to kind of engage people, we need to ensure our actions are meaningful so that anything that we're asking people to do, we really understand the way in which that is going to help drive change. And that doesn't need to be immediate change, right? So if we're talking about a hand raiser, that's not going to drive immediate change. No one is being influenced by that as such. But what that is doing is helping an organisation build up a movement of people that they can then take on a journey in order to drive that immediate change. And I think for me, within that context of like only really ever asking people to do things that are meaningful, so having those kind of like resonant calls to action, we need to be aware that in our current sort of political context, a lot of our existing tactics aren't really having that impact. So whereas maybe 5 years ago, you get 1 million people signing a petition and it would have direct, immediate political impact. Now, we don't see that at all because politicians are just so used to riding out those. They've seen a million signature petitions and they haven't acted on them. And so they don't feel now that they need to. So it's really kind of like, okay, well, what is the thing that a person can do to really drive that change? It doesn't mean that petitions are meaningless. Again, if you get those 1 million people to sign a petition and, a vast majority of them go onto your email list, that is still a really impactful thing to have done. You've still raised awareness about this issue among lots of people. You've given them an opportunity to act and to influence. And then you can bring them in on a journey to help them do kind of what we kind of lazily call higher bar asks that then are more likely to drive that kind of immediate influence. But so I think for me, sorry, I'm going slightly off topic.
Brilliant.
One of the things that we've seen, or that I really think now is kind of really making sure that you have those kind of like, again, what we lazily call low bar asks in the mix, because there are people that you have to meet people where they're at in terms of what they're ready to do and make it as easy as possible to take action with you, but always knowing kind of how they connect into the route to change and being able to articulate that effectively. And I think that where we are getting to now is because of that kind of like petition fatigue that a lot of people talk about. For those people that are experiencing that, I do think there is scope and space for organisations to go out with slightly kind of with asks that we historically might have kind of shied away from, for example, in the social media space, because we would think that it was too big an ask for people. But I think now those people who are really feeling that apathy are very ready to do something bigger. And so we've been doing quite a lot of testing with quite a few of our partners around essentially kind of like building up like driving volunteer power in this election period and how we can use volunteers to really drive home the change, because we really see that as an important kind of, I suppose, upscaling of our tactics in this context where our sort of traditional digital tactics are they're sort of having diminishing returns a lot of the time. And so, driving, like making sure that we're kind of factoring into the asks that we give to people things that we might have historically shied away from, and like asking them to volunteer to take action locally, or asking them to be part of a kind of like rapid response social media group, like talking about needing to fight disinformation in the TikTok space, for example, really trying to get people to sign up to kind of be your messenger in TikTok, and thinking about some of those asks that really kind of, like I say, you have a really clear reason why that's going to help you affect change this year or tackle disinformation. And in being able to kind of communicate that to the people you're asking to act with you. But I think like we still need to use our tried and tested techniques for bringing people on board to a campaign, and like doing those value-based mass recruitment methods is really important, as long as they are like optimized to do that ongoing engagement. And as long as you are set up to know what that ongoing engagement looks like. It's a bit like what you were saying, Paul. It's like not just bringing people onto your mailing list for the sake of it. It's like making sure that is because you have a full strategy that understands how those people coming onto your mailing list is going to help you to deliver the change. And you have a clear sense of the ways in which them giving you a share of their time, money and voice can help to deliver that change. And we find that email lists that get the best engagements always have a mix of those time, money, voice asks, so that you're really meeting people where they are and what they're kind of able to give. So for some people that will be time, and they will want to go out and do that kind of organising in their local community, door knocking, etc. For some people that will be, actually at the moment I'm going to give money to support your work. And for others that will be voice, in the sense that they want to sign petitions, they want to email their MP, they want to amplify things on social media. So just making sure that you're kind of always thinking about those categories of asks and the ways in which they can help you achieve your goals is kind of a really key thing that we try to work with people on, in order to always ensure that whatever it is you're going out to people with is meaningful and genuinely has that like direct route back to what you're trying to achieve. I feel like I rambled.
No, that was amazing, Barry. Thank you. What a powerful note to end on, getting people to really think about that very precious attention that supporters of all kinds are giving organ, and what you can do with that and how you can work with them and really live your values and create that sense of community around wherever you go next. So that's brilliant. Thank you. And you've shared so much great advice today. It's been so useful and so practical. And I hope as many people as possible hear this conversation and act on all the brilliant things you've shared. So thank you.
Thank you.
And where can people find out more about you and what you do?
So we have a website, which is forwardaction.uk. We're also on LinkedIn. It's probably the best place to find us and connect with us. Or you can connect with me on LinkedIn, Barry Cochrane.
We'll put those links in the show notes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you so much once again to Barry for coming onto the podcast and sharing her amazing insights with us.
Yeah, thank you to Barry for joining us, and another Arsenal fan to add to the growing list of Arsenal fans who've been on the podcast. So you can tell I was made up by that.
You restrained yourself there. You've finally managed to get in a football reference, the 11th hour, so well done. As always, we really do appreciate that you've listened all the way to the end of this episode, so thank you. You can support the podcast by leaving us a 5-star review wherever you listen to us. It really does help us reach more people. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard, please do share this episode with a friend.
Thank you so much for listening today, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks with another brand new episode of Starts at the Top and our second UK election special.
Can't wait. See you then, and bye for now.